the hip bone or the os coxa bone. First thing I want to start with, this bone is actually in 3 different parts. Starting about mid portion of this socket all the way up to here, all of that part, that's called the ilium. This part towards the back, so starting like right there, including this bump on the back, so all of that part of the bone is called the ischium. And then right here in the front, there's a piece that comes down like that and it goes around. That's called the pubis bone. And that's where the hip bones come together in the front and they form a joint called the symphysis pubis. So this has to point in the front. Now you want to orient yourself to this bone first of all. This big notch in the back, right here, which is called the greater sciatic notch, that's always posterior. So that way you know this is the back of the bone, this portion, because of that big notch. This in the front would be the front of the bone. That's anterior. That big notch is always in the back. So I'm going to start with the ilium first. This ridge on the top is called the iliac crest. It's the upper part of the hip bones. This socket that I keep pointing to, that's actually called the acetabulum. It's this deep socket where the hip bone, or excuse me, where the femur goes. And then what you have, and I'm going to turn it this way, you have what are called spines on the ilium. There's one here, and there's one at the top right there. There's one on the back part here, and there's one underneath like this. And like I said, just remember, this big notch is always posterior. So I'm going to start with this one first. This is called the superior anterior iliac spine. The part down here is called the anterior inferior iliac spine. On the back, that part is called the posterior superior iliac spine because it's in the back and it's on top. And down here, this part, this looks like a little bump, is called the posterior inferior iliac spine. And this big, deep crevice, you can see it, is called the greater sciatic notch. Now if I turn it this way, starting here, like I said, greater sciatic notch, this little projection right there on the bottom, that's called the ischial spine. It sticks out the back. And then what you have right there below it, you can see, that's called the lesser sciatic notch. So you got the greater sciatic notch, the ischial spine, looks like this. You can see it sticking out at the bottom. And then here's the lesser sciatic notch. And this large bump here on the bottom, that's called the ischial tuberosity. That is actually the part of the hip that a person would sit on. So when you're sitting in a chair, you're actually sitting on this bottom part down here. This big opening, which is where blood vessels and nerves go through, this is called the obturator foramen. It's part of the os coxa bone. And then this area in the front, which is called the pubis bone, it has 2 pieces of bone. There's a bottom portion here that's called the inferior ramus, and then there's a top part up here that's called the superior ramus, and that's part of the pubis bone. So all of that, they have individual names, but that's the pubis. This part in the back would be the ischium, and then all of this at the top is the ilium, and that's the os coxa bone.